another question, expanding here on the subject of coils. This person's asking, I'm wondering if you'd be interested in going over this subject in a video. Coils and their relation to their power. Common sense tells me the power increases with the number of wraps, so 8 wraps are less powerful than 10. But what happens if the power, if you have 8 wraps on a 32mm versus 8 wraps 25mm? Less wire, smaller core. So the 25 should be less powerful than the 32. And what if you were to compare, say, 8 wrap 32 versus 10 wrap 25? He's talking 32mm tall, 8 wraps versus 10 wraps 25mm tall. Then of course you have the stilted and half tilted coils. Would be possible to come up with some sort of table comparing the power outputs of coils being used. For example, choose the engine according to its intended uses unless you disregard all these factors and just adjust the voltage until you find a sweet spot, but then the spot is only one, blah blah blah. Also, would it be possible to combine 8 and 10 wraps in one machine, or is it an electromagnetic nonsense? I'm thinking stronger coil in the back of the machine would provide more. Okay, well, I have gone over some of those things before. In the video, I believe it's pretty old, I show you where I completely remove the rear coil, because the rear coil, like I've said, because like again, I'm going to use the diving board thing here. When you're way out on the end of the diving board, it's very springy. When you're standing near where it's bolted down, the thing don't move much because it's all resistance, because you're right next to the deck. So this coil is actually pulling from right here, which is like bolted to right there, so it's like hell resistance versus, you know, the fulcrum, you're out here and this one's pulling it down. So the front one's actually doing like 95% of the work. The rear coil is practically fucking useless. This inline design is really kind of stupid. If both coils were side by side out here, you would be able to run the machine on 2 volts. You're really most of your power is going to pushing this, and it's not really doing anything. So I mean, you're feeding this to do all the work. This can be removed and it's still going to run with just very little increase. So it doesn't matter how many wraps you put on the back versus the front. As far as the whole wrap thing, I'm going to clarify this so I don't have to keep saying that word, but it's layers, not wraps. So on a 8-layer coil, standard coil, which is 1 1/4, US standard 1 1/4, 8 layers, you're talking 300 some wraps right there. The feet in that wire create resistance. So the more layers you put on there, the more feet of wire you have, the more resistance. Resistance fights your current, so therefore you have to put more current into it as you add layers. So you can't just 10 layers is more powerful, 12 layers is more powerful. No, because at a certain point you start creating so much resistance that you're negating the whole factor. It's pointless. You're going backwards at a certain point. The other factor would be, as he was asking, the height. Okay, here is a US 1 1/4. Here's a US 1 inch, true 1 inch. This is a Chinese short coil. So you can see it's not a true 1 inch, nor is it 1 1/2. It's somewhere in between. It's 1 1/8. Some, you know, they can't even get the math right on that. So the height will add feet, take away feet. What's more important, as you can see right here, you have 9/16 standard is the standard core diameter. I believe this is 5/8, so the fatter ones have more mass in the core, and that's where your true magnetic field comes from. I have made short coils with these, but it's really not necessary. If if I were to do a shader, anything with a longer stroke on a short, then I would use the thicker core, because you're energizing this. The more mass you have in your core, the more magnetic flux you're going to get. It's more important to have more mass in your core than it is more layers of wire. So as far as 8, 10 being better than 8, it's all relevant. It's also relevant to the wire. Is it a cheap aluminum wire? Is it copper coated aluminum wire? Is it 26 gauge? All of those factors create resistance. So do extra layers. So you have shitty wire and lots of layers doesn't make it better, it just adds more and more resistance. It actually makes it worse. Cheap wire at 8 layers is much better than 10 layers of cheap wire because you have more resistance than power. Another factor with the cores, with Chinese cores, even if you, some of them look like a silvery kind of, it's not like this kind of gray metal. It's, this is just regular steel gray. I'm talking like a hazy, kind of shitty looking cheap metal gray. Or they'll put a coating over it, kind of like a nickel plating. If you were to grind those down, you will see colors in the metal that show you like zinc and copper and all kinds of alloys that's an impure in a lot of Chinese cores. So it's a weak metal. It's not true steel. As far as that whole low carbon thing goes, that goes with magnetic memory, and if you have low carbon, then when you energize it, it snaps. I mean, it energizes immediately. When you cut off, when the circuit breaks, it drops the field completely right away, instead of lagging and have magnetic memory and kind of letting go slowly. So really what makes a coil strong is quality material. It's not the layers, it's the quality of the wire, it's the quality of the core. That's the entire reason why Chinese cores are shit, because the metal is poor and the wire is poor. As long as you're using true steel for your cores and you're not using bobbins. See, that's, and bobbins, plastic bobbins. Imagine putting shitty wire wrapped around a plastic field. Now it's got to go through the plastic bobbin to get to the shitty core. Now you can only imagine why Chinese cores are such shit. So it's not just the layering. So what I would stick to is just stick to materials. As long as you have quality coils, the materials are copper wire, 24 gauge to 22 gauge to 26 gauge. The thinner the wire, the more resistance. So you don't want that. The height of the coil, if you're going to do a long stroke, I would say either use, if it's a shorty coil and you're going to try and make a long stroke out of it, use the fatter cores. If it's a long stroke, either use the fatter cores or tall coils, so you end at 10 layers. 10 layers tall coil, or just use 8 layers on a fat. You can't even get 10 layers on a fat coil. It'll be too wide. It won't fit. That's another reason why you can't just keep adding layers. At some point the coils are going to run into each other. So no, I'm not going to create a great big explanatory table going over all that. Stilted coils, the reason I've done stilted coils, or anybody does, usually it's always going to be the rear coil that's stilted, and that goes right back to where I told you the rear coil means nothing. So to stilt it isn't going to change anything. All it does is cut its power down in half, and since it's not really doing anything anyway, it's not going to matter. I would still keep stilted coils to a short stroke because they don't need a whole lot of power. I guess that pretty much covers that question, right? Okay.